Good evening. My name is Cliff Robinson, and I'm joining you from the Princeton room at the Princeton Public Library, where, as the Public Humanities Specialist, I lead the library's Public Humanities Initiative. You can learn more about the Public Humanities Initiative by visiting the library's webpage, princetonlibrary.org/events/humanities, and I'll share that also in the chat right now. There you can also learn about support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which made this program and others like it possible. Tonight's program falls within the library's Public Humanities Author Series on Justice, which continued last month with a conversation between Peniel Joseph and Lawrence Ralph on Joseph's new book, Freedom Season. That conversation is now available on the library's YouTube channel. Throughout 2025, with this author series and other related programs, the library's Public Humanities Initiative will be exploring justice from multiple perspectives and through the intersecting textures of our dense social fabric. Looking ahead, I'd like to flag the next upcoming author event in the series. That is on October 21st at 7 p.m. in the library's community room. Raquel Salazar Pareñas, joining conversation by Martina van den Berg, will present The Trafficker Next Door, How Household Employers Exploit Domestic Workers. Look out for these and other programs about which you can find out more at the webpage I just shared. So this evening, it is my honor to introduce our presenter, Cass Sunstein, who will present his new book on liberalism and defense of freedom. The publisher, MIT Press, describes it as a much-needed defense of liberalism, what it is, why it is under threat, and why we need it more than ever, from one of our most important political thinkers today. The description goes on. More than at any time since World War II, liberalism is under pressure, even siege. On the right, some have given up on liberalism. They hold it responsible for the collapse of the family and traditional values, rampant criminality, disrespect for authority, and widespread immorality. On the left, some are turning their backs on liberalism. They think that it lacks the resources to handle the problems posed by entrenched inequalities, racism, sexism, corporate power, and environmental degradation. But those opposed to liberalism do not depict it accurately. They offer a caricature, and they neglect its history. On Liberalism, former advisor to Presidents Obama and Biden and New York Times bestselling author Cass Sunstein offers a timely and clear understanding of liberalism, of its core commitments, of its breadth, of its internal debates, of its evolving character, of its promise, and why we need it more than ever. He also shows how and why liberalism has been and should be appealing to both the left and the right. The book begins with a manifesto on behalf of liberalism and then goes on to explore the central idea of experiments of living, to which a liberal constitutional order gives pride of place. From there, it discusses John Stuart Mill and Friedrich Hayek, defining liberal thinkers. The rule of law as liberals understand it, freedom of speech, including the place of lies and falsehood within that freedom, free markets, economic liberty and regulation, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, with its social and economic guarantees, and finally, the concept of opportunity. Never more urgently needed, On Liberalism moves the conversation well beyond the reductive and inflammatory political sound bites of our moment and advances a compelling argument on behalf of liberalism as the foundation of freedom and self-government. On Liberalism is available in the library's collection, and it has already been circulating well, so I imagine some of you joining us tonight may have already read it. For anyone who would like to place it on hold, here is the link to our catalog. Drop that in the chat as well. The book can also be purchased through the MIT Press at this link. And if you can't wait for delivery from the publisher, I'll add that our frequent collaborator on the Labyrinth Live at the Library series, Labyrinth Books, currently has several copies in stock. So, with all that said, now I come to our presenter. Cass Sunstein is currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law School. He is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, sometimes described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and the Humanities. In 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its Technical Advisory Group on Behavioral Insights and Sciences for Health. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and after that, he served on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communications Technologies and on the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board. Professor Sunstein has testified before congressional committees on many subjects, and he has advised officials at the UN, the European Commission, the World Bank, and many nations on issues of law and public policy. He has served as an advisor to the Behavioral Insights team in the United Kingdom. In addition to On Liberalism, Professor Sunstein is the author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books, including Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, Simpler, The Future of Government, The Ethics of Influence, #Republic, Impeachment, A Citizen's Guide, The Cost-Benefit Revolution, On Freedom, Conformity, How Change Happens, Too Much Information, and Climate Justice. I'll also add, he is the author of a Substack newsletter, which I'll also share in the chat. So you can check that out for more occasional writing. And with that introduction complete, we'll hear first from Professor Sunstein about his book and what he has accomplished with it. I'll invite you to go ahead and start contributing questions to the queue even as he's speaking, either by using the chat or by using the Q&A functions available in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. I'm hopeful that we'll have time to get to everyone's questions, but we have a large group and a timely topic, so we'll do the best we can. I have a few questions of my own as well, but I may hold them back if there seems to be overwhelming interest from those who have tuned in. So Professor Sunstein, thank you for joining us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a complete thrill to be here because it's Princeton, because it's 2025, and because we're talking about a topic that has a certain kind of magnitude, that is liberalism. I've written a mini book for you for this occasion. It's kind of a 20-minute book, and it is not as long as the MIDI book, which is the actual book. The mini book has a preface, and then it has just 3 little chapters. So here's the preface. In 2022, once upon a time, there was a law professor, yours truly, who started writing notes to self on this very laptop about liberalism. And it was a numbered list of commitments that liberals had, and it was too long by far to be in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, and too academic by far to be in those places. But it didn't have any footnotes, and it referred to people like Kant and John Rawls, but it didn't really elaborate them in any academic detail. So it was too thin and footnote free to be in an academic journal. So it was an unpublishable essay. I sent it to 2 people, one of whom said, you should send this to the New York Times. And he had some credibility there because he worked for the New York Times. And I did. And to my astonishment, they decided to run it under the title, Why I Am a Liberal. Now, that part of the story is relatively tedious, though I thank you for your attention during it. The aftermath is less tedious. I got a flood of responses. I never had such a set of responses from people. And some of them came from people on the right, that is, people who support Republicans, who said, I agree with almost every word in this, and I am a liberal in your sense, and I'm a conservative because what I want to conserve is liberalism. And the enthusiasm from people on the political right was noteworthy, and it had a kind of emotional intensity to it. Then on the part of people on the left, I got a bunch of similar responses saying, I'm on the left, I vote for the Democrats, and I believe in freedom, the rule of law, and pluralism. And I don't like that part of the left that is illiberal or anti-liberal, that's suppressive of freedom of speech, that is not as excited about intellectual pluralism as it should be, and that maybe isn't keen on the rule of law. And the people on the right said, we are very concerned that there's right-wing thinking in Europe and the United States that's illiberal. So noting that big tent of kind notes, I thought there's a form of big tent liberalism that I'd been groping toward in the op-ed, and I should write a book about Big Tent liberalism, where the things that would be highlighted would be the holy trinity of liberal thought, that is freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law. That's not all of the Big Tent, but that's the holy trinity in the Big Tent. And the book we're discussing tonight is a reflection of that. I should say that we're continuing the preface, that in the short period since the book was published, it's been intriguing to find that some people, very animated people on the left and the right, don't like Big Tent liberalism, but that it does capture in Europe and the United States a range of thinking, both on the part of ordinary citizens who wouldn't be that keen about reading political philosophy, and on the part of political philosophers who, despite their diversity, are in accord about freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law. I might make one other prefatory note, which is the book says not a word about some political figures whose names may be in your mind right now. I think there's only one contemporary political figure who's mentioned, who is President Putin. He's called out as not a liberal, not period, a period, liberal period. That's not what the book says, but that's the emotion of the book. But it doesn't say anything about current political figures. And the reason for that is the goal was to hold up a shining light for liberalism. Okay, that's the preface. Here's chapter 1. Orwell's 1984 is a shattering depiction of anti-liberalism. One of Orwell's villains offers this warning: if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Liberals, this is my parenthetical note, don't want boots stamping on human faces ever. Consider this from Orwell: all this marching up and down and cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour. That's pretty good, Mr. Orwell. Here are the novel's chilling last words: but it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. Part of the genius of Orwell's illiberal portrayal of illiberalism or anti-liberalism is, if you read it now, you can see that Orwell saw the appeal of anti-liberal thinking and practice. So it's not a cartoonish picture deeply. Orwell was torn. Now, of course, he came down on the liberal side, but his deepest self was sympathetic and toward and appreciative of the liberal sensibility. That's the source of the power of the book. More than any time since World War II, in which my dad fought, liberalism is under siege. There's a lot of marching up and down. People are cheering. Many of them are waving flags. That's Orwell's quotation. Many of them seems to love Big Brother. They hope that they have found them. Fascists reject liberalism. So do populists who insist that freedom is overrated. In ways large and small, anti-liberalism is emphatically on the march, and so is tyranny, with both right-wing and left-wing versions. Maybe more than ever, what's needed is a clear understanding of liberalism, its big tent, its core commitments, its breadth, its internal debates, its evolving character, its promise of what it is in the world and of what it might be in the future. That's chapter 1. We've heard the preface in chapter 1. Chapter 2 is going to be an excerpt from the book in the form of a list with numbers of things that liberals are committed to. And I might say my model here is Friedrich Hayek, who is emphatically a liberal, though the left really doesn't like him. I suggest they should like him a bit better than they do, because he loved freedom. And Hayek wrote an essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative. It's a phenomenal essay, which is a numbered list of reasons why he rejects conservatism. Okay, here we go. 1, Liberals believe in freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law. That's the Holy Trinity. They also believe in security, human rights, and democracy. Those are central to liberal thinking. Security, we want to say, is associated with freedom from fear. There are a lot of people in Europe and the United States who are afraid right now. Freedom from fear, which Roosevelt kind of termed and made famous, freedom from fear is a long-standing liberal commitment. Two, liberal authoritarianism is an oxymoron because liberals believe in, guess what? Freedom, personal security, and pluralism. They reject authoritarianism in its many forms. Illiberal democracy is illiberal, and liberals oppose it for that reason. There's a nation in Europe which is proudly committed to illiberal democracy. Liberals don't like it, even if it is democratic, because it rejects the liberal commitments to freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law. Three, liberals are keenly aware that reasonable people disagree on many things, including the nature of a good life and which God to worship, if any. Liberals cherish religious liberty. They honor and frequently are people of faith. At the same time, they seek to make space for those fundamental disagreements, both to show respect for persons and to allow a kind of way of living that involves peace and mutual recognition. Four, liberals do not merely acknowledge the fact of pluralism. They don't just notice that people in Georgia are different from other people in Georgia, and people at the University of Georgia are different from people at Princeton and Yale. Of course, there's a lot of overlap, but there are differences. Liberals don't just tolerate pluralism, they cherish it as a way to ensure that human beings can learn from each other and from different experiments in how to live. Liberals want people who disagree intensely with each other, whether they follow one political leader or another, or follow one way of life or another, not just to live together, but to smile. Or if they're not going to smile, at least they're going to nod respectfully at their differences. That's the liberal attitude toward pluralism. Five, the liberal emphasis on pluralism is hard to disentangle, and this is a good thing, from the liberal commitments to freedom and security. Those who reject pluralism render people unfree and insecure, and sometimes imprison or kill them. Note parenthetically that I'm reading right now, just before these remarks, a book called Waiting to be Arrested at Night, an Uyghur poet's memoir of China's genocide. And the book is a shattering depiction of how rejection of the liberal commitment to pluralism and security renders people unfree and insecure, and sometimes imprisons or kill them. So that's not rhetoric. I might note also parenthetically that I've spent a lot of time in the context of this book in the 1930s, looking at the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy and elsewhere. And liberalism seen against that backdrop isn't boring. Six, understood in the way I've been depicting it thus far, liberalism consists of commitments that have concrete implications for politics and law. In North America, Europe, and elsewhere, those who consider themselves to be conservatives may or may not embrace liberal commitments. I might note I worked for President Reagan as a very young lawyer, scandalously young. Okay, not that young. I did work for President Reagan as a young lawyer. And in the first year when I worked there in the Department of Justice, I can attest to this, the commitment to pluralism, the rule of law, and freedom was robust, chez conservative President Reagan. Those who consider themselves to be leftists may or may not be liberals. You can be at once a liberal, as I'm understanding it here, and a conservative. You can be a leftist and illiberal. So I'm using liberal in the political theoretical sense, not in the left of center, right of center sense. There are illiberal conservatives and illiberal leftists. In politics, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, the great Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Massachusetts' own John F. Kennedy, Texas's Lyndon Baines Johnson, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Angela Merkel all count as part of the liberal tradition. This is so even though there are many fierce disagreements among them, hence Big Tent liberalism. 7. Abraham Lincoln was a liberal. We all know much about Lincoln, and I might note that for a long time, my favorite American president has been Franklin Delano Roosevelt, notwithstanding the fact that most people would rank Lincoln above him. An investigation of liberalism and its history and Lincoln's relationship to it justifies Lincoln's primacy among many historians. I'd like you to hear what Lincoln said in 1854. If the Negro is a man, is it not to that extent a total destruction of self-government to say that he too shall not govern himself? When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism. No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. I say this is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicanism. My gosh, there's a lot there. What Lincoln is doing is linking the attack on slavery with the American Revolution and the American commitment to self-government. What he's doing is devising a conception of liberalism that sees slavery as a horror for the same reason that despotism in politics is a horror, because both of them obliterate people's ability to govern themselves. Slavery does that, and so does despotism. They're both forms of despotism. And notice Lincoln's use of the word sheet anchor. That is not an ordinary anchor. It's the most reliable one you've got, the one least likely to fail under extreme stress. It's the equivalent of a port in a storm. Liberals really like this. No man is good enough to govern another without that other's consent. Liberals can embrace that general proposition while having very different views about the right attitude toward abortion, smoking, immigration, alcohol consumption, climate change, artificial intelligence, and constitutional law. 8. While liberals have not always been committed to democracy, and that's important to acknowledge, they have always been committed to freedom. That's why some people think it's intelligible to describe illiberal democracy or liberal non-democracy. Some people think those are intelligible ideas. Some liberals have thought that there is a right to immunity from the power of the state without also denying, while also denying that there's a right to self-governance in the form of popular control of the power of the state. So some liberals say you have rights, that's liberal rights, but you don't have self-governance rights. In my view, Lincoln had it right. He captured the underlying logic of liberalism in linking freedom with self-government and hence democracy. Freedoms in one's personal life, a right to self-governance writ small for each of us, is connected with freedom in one's civic life, a right to self-governance writ large. The Voting Rights Act is a liberal product. 9, liberals are committed to individual dignity. They see people as subjects, not as objects, and they prize the idea of personal agency. They agree with Lincoln. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. They regard John Stuart Mill's great book, The Subjection of Women, as helping to define the essence of liberalism. Thus, Mill wrote a long, long time ago, the legal subordination of one sex to another is wrong as in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. 10. Liberals insist on reason giving in the public domain. They want accountability. They also insist on reason giving. They see reason giving as a check on authoritarianism. They know that authoritarians, Stalin, Hitler, feel free to exercise power and to use force without justifying their choices. 11. The liberal commitment to reason giving helps spur the liberal commitment to an idea of a deliberative democracy, a burden of deliberation accompanying the burden of accountability. Public power cannot be exercised on the ground that the king says so, the president says so, or God says so, or even the people say so. 12. Liberals do not believe that their own approach is frozen in time. They don't fear change. In their view, liberalism is not like a rock. It is like a tree. It is constantly growing. 13. What John Dewey said of the United States is also true of liberalism. Be the evils what they may, the experiment is not yet played out. The United States are not yet made. They are not a finished fact to be categorically assessed. William F. Buckley Jr., I have a complicated relationship to him. He was a hero of mine when I was a youngster, and I learned a lot about writing and about political theory from William F. Buckley Jr. But he's the foundation of 14 and the last of chapter 2. William F. Buckley Jr., this is 14, famously said that his preferred form of conservatism, quote, stands athwart history, yelling stop. That's a famous line from the first issue of National Review. It's a good line. Liberals don't think that way. They ask history to explain its plans. And if the explanation is good enough, they're prepared to whisper, go. All right, chapter 3, the last chapter. Ready? Some people think that freedom is incompatible with order. Have you noticed? They think that people will choose poorly. They see freedom as a threat. When freedom of speech is shut down, that's a standard reason. Many people think that the rule of law is compatible with many things, but not compatible with security. They suspend the rule of law in security's name. Of course, many people deplore liberty because they seek to retain their power and their privilege. The rights that liberals prize are an outgrowth of their commitment to freedom. The right to vote, the right to freedom of speech, the right to religious liberty, the right to due process of law. I might note that when I was a law student, I came across a sentence from a Supreme Court justice named Felix Frankfurter, who said the history of freedom under Anglo-American law is in large part the history of procedural safeguards. And I thought, my gosh, he must have been very old and kind of not thinking much. How could that be the liberty? Procedural safeguards. But in 2025, in a period where all over the world, procedural safeguards are occasionally at least endangered, Frankfurter's insistence on the centrality of due process, an independent judiciary, a right to a hearing, a right to a fair chance to have your say, Frankfurter knew a lot better than this law student did. That is me. The right to private property, often deplored by the left, should not be deplored by anyone. It's closely associated with Lincoln's sheet anchor. If you can't own things, you're vulnerable to the power of others, including the government. Hooray for private property. True, no ism can offer concrete solutions to concrete problems. You can agree with John Stuart Mill or John Rawls without knowing how to approach a proposed increase in the minimum wage or whether the government should reopen soon. You can be liberal without knowing what you think about immigration. You can believe in freedom of speech without knowing how to handle commercial advertising and pornography. You can believe in freedom of religion without having clarity on some of the issues about which Americans are divided. Liberals can divide on those. Now I'm going to tell you the emotional heart of the book. You're about to hear it. This is Department of Full Disclosure. In its early days, liberalism was full of fire. It's impossible to read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, 1859, without feeling that fire. If all mankind minus one, Mill wrote, were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. That's fiery. Recall the sentence from The Subjection of Women. The legal subordination of one sex to the other is wrong in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. You can also feel the fire in Benjamin Constant's Principles of Politics, applicable to all governments, written in 1815, and notice the title, Principles of Politics applicable to all governments. That's liberal imperialism right there. Here's what Constant writes. Political freedom would be a thing of no value if the rights of individuals were not sheltered from all violation. Any country where these rights are not respected is a country subjected to despotism, whatever the nominal organization of government may be. That's liberalism in its days of urgency. John Stuart Mill's A Theory of Justice in 1971 is so much quieter. It's a very great book. Here's its quiet final line, gentle. Purity of heart, if one could attain it, would be to see clearly and to act with grace and self-command from this point of view. That's a soft last line. It would be extreme to say that over a half century after Rawls's great book, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. That's from Yeats. The best do not lack conviction. But it wouldn't be extreme to say that some current accounts of liberalism are defensive. They seem tired, passive, backward-looking, even nostalgic. Call it defensive crouch liberalism. That's not what we need. In law and politics, as in sports, the best offense is sometimes a good defense. That's true. Still, a defining feature of liberalism has always been its youth, its energy and its fierceness, its delight in human agency, its openness to novelty and surprise, its high spirits, its implacable opposition to cruelty, its capacity for indignation, its optimism, its continuing adventures in self-definition, its refusal to despair, its sense of mischief, its commitment to experiments in living. Liberalism is full of hope. Hopeful people are remaking it each and every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent taste of the sort of, I think you called it the mini book, right? Yeah, the spirit of it comes through definitely, and thankful to you for sharing that. So I'm going to keep an eye out for questions. So feel free to pop those into the Q&A or the chat, whatever is more comfortable for you. I think I'll get us started with a few questions myself. So, um, yeah, okay. So a little place setting. You sort of touched on this already, but we're gathered virtually here on the first day of a shutdown of the federal government, a breakdown of our system's functioning, which has grown more frequent and more damaging since the 1980s. Mindful of these circumstances and your expertise in government and law, I wonder if you might share a few thoughts on how your perspective on liberalism informs this moment. Is this shutdown symptomatic of breakdown within liberal government, or is it a symptom of liberalism's abandonment? How do you see it?
Well, let's say that we cherish freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom as an ideal, of which freedom of speech and religion are kind of the two champions. Let's say also that we think the rule of law is at the core of a well-functioning uh, economy. I was at the University of Chicago for a long time, so I'm keen on that. And also at the core of a well-functioning political order. And let's say the word pluralism, which in one form is on our currency, something kind of poetic about that, is at the heart of e pluribus unum, is at the heart of America. Then we would say that anything that compromises those values runs up against liberal commitments, might well violate the Constitution, but violates something that conservatives and liberals have widely shared. Now, if you have a shutdown where, let's say, one party thinks that a certain plan, economic plan is a great idea, the other think it's a horrible idea, it can be that they're both acting consistently with liberal principles or not inconsistently with it, that they disagree on funding priorities. And there's nothing, um, untoward from the liberal point of view. It might be have bad consequences. And I think both the R's and the D's in any shutdown have they're in a very high stakes game of poker where concession might be better than a long-term shutdown, but being conceded to is better than a short-term shutdown. And you don't know how it's all going to play out, and there's a gamble under circumstances of uncertainty. I do think it's fair to say that some of the energy on the part of the Democrats is informed by a thought that some liberal commitments are under pressure. So that's not the text, but I do think it's the subtext of some of this. And the book is emphatically a nonpartisan book. It doesn't mention Senator Schumer. It doesn't mention the president. It doesn't take a stand on Republicans versus Democrats. But I think it wouldn't be wrong to say that some people now, including people on the political right, are scared that liberal commitments are under pressure. I think that's a thing right now. And um, the fact is that there are many Americans who are frightened even to talk publicly. I mean, literally frightened. That's something bad could happen to them. And whether the fear is justified or not, let's just bracket that. It doesn't not exist.
Sure. Yeah. I'll follow up on that with a question about fear, which is something that obviously permeates our culture today in a number of registers. Um, and it's something that you touched upon in your remarks. So, what occurred to me in reading the book and in your comments, both the comment uh, about the oral comment about sex gone sour, and I think there's a quote from the book that I'll read here. My emphasis on freedom from fear in the book was not unrelated to observing people who are not free from fear. So, to your point, um, I guess what I'm asking after in this is whether you feel like liberalism has a prevailing affect. Is there another sort of tenor of feeling that's like substantive for liberalism?
Liberals are anti-laughter. So that's one thing that is a liberal affect. If and Orwell, had wit, as well as depth of soul. So, I mean, one of the most kind of common objections to liberalism, I'm going to sneak up on your good question, and I deal with it in the book, but maybe not adequately. It comes from Tocqueville and it's from the right, and see if this resonates with people, is that you need people to love their family, love their community, love their creator. I mean, take your pick of which of those, maybe all. Some people will insist on all. And liberalism is corrosive to commitments that societies need in order to be stable. Because on this view, liberalism is so freedom focused that it uh, destroys bonds of connection which aren't chosen. That's a thought, and it's gotten some traction on the right, particularly, I think, in the last few years, but it's been an anti-liberal theme for a long, long time. I don't think it's right because liberalism doesn't say anything negative about bonds of connection that predate choice. If people, love their parents or love their community or love their creator, liberalism isn't about that. It's about freedom, the rule of law, and pluralism. So, how a commitment to the rule of law can corrode, let's say, a communal tie is mysterious. How a commitment to pluralism can is also mysterious. If we had a conception of freedom which was antithetical to the relevant bonds, then we would have a problem. But that's not the liberal conception of freedom. Liberal conception of freedom is, fundamentally rooted in freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It also includes private property. The idea of freedom from fear is, it has vagueness in it. But the idea is that you shouldn't be terrified of your neighbors or of your government, and that rights will be in place such that you don't have to be terrified. That there will be protections of you, your person, and your property. I should say that from fear as a liberal theme, it's old, but its centrality in the book was in the drafting, and you've got it exactly right. That there are people, I worked in China. I taught in China just for 2 weeks a long time ago. And I asked them to write little papers on what China could learn from American law or what America learned from Chinese law. That was their final assignment. And they all refused to do it. And I loved my students and they were great and they refused to do it. And I said, why won't you do the assignment? You just have one assignment. And they said, a bunch of them came up to me kind of quietly and said, we're afraid that it'll get in the wrong hands. And they were really scared. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think like what your opening comment there about anti laughter sort of brought to mind Charlie Chaplin for me as maybe an iconic liberal figure in his own way, right? A different register from some of the
Completely.
figures you're speaking
Completely.
about, but I really like that
Completely.
idea. And
There is, I mean, if you read books about anti-liberal societies, what you're getting at something the book only ventures lightly into, but there's something about the laughter that is cruel or
yeah,
um, it's not like real laughter. It's cruel or relief or of a linkage of laughing at enemies or threats. There's sadism in some of it. Now I'm getting a little out of my depth here, but there's something really fantastic about uh, liberal laughter, which is free. It's free.
really nice. Yeah, the no terror, no fear. It's almost like a natural impulse towards
Yeah.
laughter and
Yeah.
joy. Yeah, I really like that. A couple of questions have come in. I have some others which I'll come to if I can, but I don't want to speak over everyone who joined us tonight. So, first question, how does liberalism view equality, especially economic equality? I think this is a great question that sort of picks up where we left off, given the Roosevelt connection between freedom of fear and freedom of want, right? This is something you emphasize in the chapter on FDR.
Hey, this is a fantastic question. So liberals have different, it's a big tent. So there are liberals who think that protection against acute deprivation is something a liberal society needs to be committed to. So Roosevelt said a right to an education, a right to protection if you're sick or disabled, a right to protection if you're old, a right to protection if you're poor, a right to a home, Roosevelt said. So my favorite form of liberalism is committed to help in the form of opportunity first and foremost, but also of safeguards in the event that opportunity isn't enough. Might be that your legs don't work or you're struggling with something, so opportunity isn't going to get you there. So opportunity and protection for those at the bottom. My preferred form of liberalism is enthusiastic about. There are liberals who think that the state shouldn't be in that business. It's for private persons to be helping others, and the state should provide freedom from fear and police force and fire protection and charity and welfare. That should all be done privately. I don't love that form of liberalism, but I consider those who have it to be fellow liberals. If what's meant by equality is literal economic equality, so that, let's say, no one can have more or less than $100,000 a year, that's not a liberal theme. So disparities in income and wealth are things that liberals are typically comfortable with, though if the disparities come from injustice, absolutely not. And if the people who are doing not so well don't have a chance to exceed the people who are doing super well, that's really bad. So maybe another way to put it is liberals prize careers open to talents first and foremost, but my favorite liberals also want a lot more than that. The Affordable Care Act, liberals can disagree about. I really like it, but there are people who are faithful liberals who don't like it at all. The Social Security Act, I think, is a great liberal achievement. I love the earned income tax credit. And many liberals sing that same song. But if you say, I don't like Social Security, I want that to be all private stuff, you're not excluded from the liberal club.
Great, thanks. Okay, I think we'll go to the next question. So, why do you think liberals from both parties do not break from silos to oppose governments from either side that violate liberties? Can you offer suggestions to solve this?
It's a great question. Well, when a recent event which I will speak about, even though my book is not about current events, Jimmy Kimmel, the pressuring of a private broadcaster to take him off the air. Senator Cruz was speaking as a liberal, not as a left of center, but as a devoted champion of freedom of speech when he said this is very bad. I didn't think his comment was perfect, if I may say, because I thought, though I greatly admired that he made it, because Senator Cruz said, if we do this, then the left will go after us. And it shouldn't be thinking that it's bad because then the left will do it. It should be thinking it's bad because it's bad. And I think Senator Cruz deeply believes that. He believes that to censor people or to pressure people from the government side to restrict speech because it has the wrong point of view, I think he deeply believes that's wrong. So this is just an example of Senator Cruz being someone who stood up for a liberal principle. And during times in which liberal commitments have been challenged, you can take your pick. There have been people from the same party as the president, let's say, has been doing the thing, who've said, I'm not for that. That needs to stop. It's still a great question, and my giving examples of kind of contrary evidence, it doesn't really meet the question. We do have something in our country now, let's call it partyism, where people identify very intensely with their party. It has some overlap with racism. It's not the same by any means, but in the sense of an automatic antipathy. And in my various stays in Washington, I saw it where people would say behind closed doors, I'm a Republican. I think on this the Democrats are right, but they would never say it publicly. Tell you a story. When I was nominated for one of my jobs, I was confirmed by the Senate. I had to be confirmed by the Senate, and I was lucky enough and honored enough to be confirmed. But there was one Republican who wouldn't allow me to have a vote. He opposed me, and he wouldn't even meet with me, and that was a very difficult situation. He could block the vote, and he wouldn't meet with me. Finally agreed to meet with me. And he said, you know what we need for the job you've been nominated for? I said, we need a guy who's a law professor. We need someone who's lost some hair up top. We need a guy who's a little over 6 feet tall. We need someone who likes racket sports and play some squash. We need someone who studies administrative law. I basically said all of my characteristics. And I said, well, I have a brother like that. And he said, you're going to be great. You're fantastic. And then he paused and he said, of course, I'm going to vote against you. And I loved his honesty, and he was very charming. But, he didn't need to say anything except that he couldn't say publicly that I was going to be good, he needed to vote against me. Now, the meeting was sufficiently genial that he allowed me to have a vote. So thank you, Senator, for that. But to say publicly, my party's wrong or the leader of my party's wrong, that's dangerous. And it might even be literally dangerous. You might encourage violence.
Thanks. The next question, I think I'll tie it together with something I was going to ask too, because I think it will help to set it up. So someone from the audience has written in, how does the originalist interpretation of the Constitution affect the rule of law? So I'll set that up by reading back a quote from the book. This is on page 25, if anyone happens to have the book in front of them. And it's just after a quote from Mills on Liberty about where the key phrase, experiments of living, is featured. And you write, Professor Sunstein, here is a proposal for your consideration. Experiments of living constitutionalism. And I think that phrase together, experiments of living constitutionalism, is sort of a concept, let's say. We can understand the idea of constitutionalism both figuratively and literally. In its figurative sense, we might see a commitment to experiments of living as undergirding political practice. A liberal nation might say, we protect a wide range of experiments. If it says that, it is offering a defining commitment, a kind of promise. The commitment need not have the same kind of status as a formal constitutional commitment. It might simply be understood as a background principle of a liberal regime. So the reason I bring this in here is that in reading, this is chapter 3 of the book, I want to say, and in it, it feels to me like you're setting up a case for this experiments of living constitutionalism as some kind of alternative to originalism, like another mode of interpretation that you'd like to champion. So maybe you can answer the question, but also speak to sort of how you'd like this to impact, let's say, not just the legal profession, but the work of justices across the U.S. And anyway, I'll let you speak.
Right. So if you're an originalist, you might think the rule of law is sacrosanct because the original public meaning of the Constitution requires the rule of law. So here's the question. What is the rule of law? If the rule of law means that the law has to be clear rather than vague, the law has to be applied prospectively, not retrospectively, that the law has to work in the real world the way it does on the books, that people have a right to a hearing, if you think that's the core of the rule of law, originalists might be keen on it, depending on whether the original meaning of the Constitution calls for it. In my view, something like the rule of law is required by the original public meaning of the Constitution, though to vindicate that, one would need historical evidence. But the rule of law ideal, in the way I've described it, was so ingrained in the American culture at the time of the founding that that's highly likely to be, in the end, the view that history supports. So an originalist can say rule of law, absolutely. I think an originalist has a harder time having a very robust conception of freedom of speech, because the historical materials suggest that while the founders certainly were committed to freedom of speech, their conception of it was much less robust, much narrower and more modest than Americans now would tolerate. I think that's right. Okay, on experiments of living versus originalism, our constitutional understandings are not compatible with the original public meaning of the document. So sex discrimination is forbidden. The original public meaning of the Constitution does not forbid sex discrimination. If the federal government said we're only going to hire white people, that would violate the Constitution as it's now understood. It's very hard to argue that that would violate the original public meaning of the Constitution. There isn't even an equal protection clause applicable to the federal government. So originals have a lot to say about the sorts of things I'm describing, but in my view, and I think originalists would agree with this and lament it, I agree with it and celebrate it, we don't have an originalist understood Constitution. There are different methods of interpretation, which basically take the Constitution to set out broad principles whose meaning isn't confined to the understanding of their meaning at the time of ratification. Now, my experiments of living constitutionalism idea, it originally was meant in my first draft as a kind of thought experiment, just to see what it would be like. But I got more enthusiastic about it as I thought about it and wrote about it. So the notion that experiments of living are part of what our constitutional order protects, I'm mostly on board that train.
That's really great. I think it's an idea that has a lot of promise.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we're at the hour. So if there aren't any other questions, I think it's appropriate at this point to thank you again for joining us this evening to share some insight into your book. I highly recommend it. It's timely. So thank you again. And I guess we can say good night.
Good night. Thanks to all. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all.